6 years after the events of the Happy Hills homicide, Brian Pawlowski, a police detective, sits at home, watching TV with a lukewarm beer on the side table. Brian hasn't exactly been doing well ever since the Pale Grin escaped him before. The phone rings. Stewart, an officer at the station Brian works at, reveals that John Wade is back and has killed again. Welcome back, I'm Nox, and this Synopsis Studio episode is about the Happy Hills Homicide 2, Out for Blood. Brian arrives at the crime scene. Another person who was involved with West Pine High, the school John worked at where he was bullied relentlessly by students and staff alike. Upon investigating, Brian finds that the crime scene is nearly identical to one of John's early murders. However, once he finds the body, he notices a struggle ensued and that everything is messy. John Wade wouldn't leave a mess like this. Even the stab wounds are identical. Is this a copycat? Brian wonders to himself. As Brian leaves, the press is already on the scene. He berates them and heads off. Somewhere outside of Happy Hills, a man in overalls and a burned head sits in the darkness, only the TV illuminating the room. He holds a familiar clown mask in his hand. John Wade seethes in the darkness. Not only is he offended at a sloppy copycat, but this person was on John's list to eventually kill. John had been resting for 6 years, but no longer. He puts on his mask and readies himself for the spree. John immediately heads to the arcade and, using a hammer and a strength machine, takes out the overnight employee, leaving behind a message with an address for Brian to eventually find. When Brian later arrives, he discovers the crime scene to be more authentic to the Pale Grin and finds the message waiting for him, an address and a date of some sort. Elsewhere, William Carpenter, who is Madison Carpenter's father, sees the local news report of the scene Brian was at. Remembering his daughter Madison and her death by John Wade, he gets up and heads out. He pulls up to a harbor and fights his way into a freight container holding the office of a crime head. The man demands John Wade's location, citing that this person and a classmate Kenzo used to mess with John. After getting information out of the crime head about Kenzo, William eliminates him. Meanwhile, John Wade descends into a sewer and, using electricity and the water level pump, eliminates someone else on his list. He then heads into a museum and, using a mace, hits the security guard, well, quite a few times actually. Look, we know John can be a bit excessive. That evening, William Carpenter rolls up to the nightclub he learned about. As per his previous approach, he proceeds to violently push his way inside. Unfortunately, William is caught off guard and knocked out by one of Kenzo's bodyguards. William awakes at a table, and across from him is another in the same boat. They're surrounded by a couple of guards, forcing them at gunpoint to participate. Kenzo reveals that he knows of William and his Vietnam War veteran status. He then forces them both to play Russian roulette as punishment for their grievances. On the last bullet, it would appear that William's time has come, but he flips the gun and shoots Kenzo through the mouth, and then quickly grabs his weapon and takes out the guard. The capture reveals information to William. John Wade's brother is in the local prison. John, feeling annoyed with Brian Pawlowski moving too slowly, decides to go after his brother, a butcher at the local slaughterhouse. Now, I'm not sure if the butcher was an actual person at West Pine High or if his death was simply to get a message to Brian Pawlowski. Using a variety of items from the warehouse, the other Pawlowski brother meets a butchering end. It was funny. A few days later, Brian, mourning the murder of his brother, continues his investigations. As Brian goes through the nightclub, a cough catches his attention. Kenzo is still alive? He's able to reveal to Brian that the attacker was William Tombstone Carpenter, Madison's father. Brian leaves with this new information and sends Kenzo a medic team. On the far side of town at the news station, the two employees, desperate for a story, plan a video shoot with a Pale Grin outfit. Their conversation also reveals to us that they killed someone to get the story, but didn't expect him to fight back. Above in the rafters, John stares down, angrily, having found his copycat. He manages to sneak up on Clay, one of the crew, and eliminates him, leaving behind the same date and address message. In parallel, William Carpenter sits on a park bench in public. He vows to find Martin Wade. Brian approaches him, revealing in his greeting that they both served in the Vietnam War together. Brian is forced to take William into custody. 4 days later, William is sitting in the local prison in the section for those waiting arraignment. He reveals that this was part of his plan to get to the prison to talk with Martin Wade, one of the lifers. During a very convenient prison riot, William manages to sneak out of his cell and down to the solitary confinement area. Martin Wade turns out to be quite gentle and cooperative. He spills the tea like no tomorrow. Martin reveals that John is actually his adoptive brother and that John murdered their father and then set up Martin to take the fall. He likes the peace and quiet and purposely gets himself thrown into solitary confinement for said peace. As William escapes the prison, Jeff, a prison guard, is revealed to be a co-veteran of William's and aided in his interrogation in order to help and put John Wade down for good. That night, John approaches a house in a nice neighborhood. Inside, a priest sits at his dining room table, dozing on and off, a large key sitting on his table in front of him. John quietly walks up and grabs the key without disturbing the priest, and then unlocks and descends down the stairs of his basement to look around. He finds a woman, still awake, tied down to a table, a variety of tools on the wall. "Looks like I'm not the only monster around here," John mumbles aloud. He ungags the woman, and by reflex, she immediately starts screaming. When the priest comes down to investigate, John, using a sharpened crucifix, murders the priest. He leaves the woman there with the crucifix to find her own way out. As he turns to leave, the dog bolts down the stairs, barking threateningly. John stares at him for a long moment, and then pets the dog, inviting her to come with him. John names her Madison. Brian investigates William Carpenter's trailer and finds his investigation board. As he ponders at the information, someone with a hood over their face bolts from the back of the trailer outside. Brian takes off in a sprint after them, chasing the person through the entire park before arriving to a cliff edge. Cornered, the person reveals himself to be Amanda, the boyfriend of the football player who started the fire at West Pine High that severely burned John Wade and nearly killed him. Amanda had been hiding in the park area after John Wade became active again, hoping to ride out the storm until William Carpenter or the police took care of John Wade. Brian takes her to the police station for safety and for further questioning. A few hours later, John Wade arrives at the police station hunting for Amanda, having found out the news somehow. He kills a police officer outside and takes his tactical gear to hide his face. John walks right into the police office, no one questioning his identity. He casually swipes a sergeant's access card, takes a knife, infrared goggles, and a smoke bomb from the armory. John walks into the main area of the office, drops the smoke bomb, and using his other tools, takes out most of the police officers. Amanda, hearing the commotion, sneaks out of the interrogation room and flees outside. Once outside, Brian loads her into the Special Forces vehicle and sends her away for safety with a team immediately. However, it appears escaping the Pale Grin is not quite so simple. Using Martin Wade's intel, William arrives to John Wade's cabin. Madison, John's new dog, runs at William, barking ferociously. William aims the gun at the dog and fires in the air, causing the dog to drop her tough girl act. William explores the house briefly and finds the same time and address that everyone else has found. William hears noise from outside a vehicle and peeks outside. The gang had followed him here. How could he be so sloppy, he wonders to himself. He sneaks outside from a hole in the side of the cabin and takes on the gang directly. When he inevitably runs out of bullets, the dog, Madison, shows up and takes out Kenzo for him. This dog really has a sense of who lesser evils are, I guess. Meanwhile, John stalks two twins, Trevor and Andy, in the subway. It's Halloween night, and even the Pale Grin doesn't stand out. Using a fire extinguisher and then the train itself, the twins meet a rather gruesome end. By the way, this guy running down the tracks here, I'm not exactly sure what his plan was, but it wasn't a good one. The meeting time finally arrives upon our characters. The rain comes down hard. Brian is the first to arrive and finds Amanda still alive. His shock causes a lapse in judgment as he realizes this is a trap. A blunt force hits him from behind. Brian stirs awake, strapped into a water ride. John stands above him. Brian observes his surroundings and notices a panel of wires by his seat, a large giant saw blade spinning ahead. As the ride starts to move, John taunts him. If you can correctly disassemble the correct wires, you are free. Brian breathes through the panic and calms himself. He carefully looks at the wires, deduces a pattern, and frees himself with moments to spare. John pushes Brian further, making him play a shooting arcade game, and then crawling around in vents for costume pieces. John forces Brian to fit the razor-lined costume pieces on Jeremy that captured Copycat. After having completed the 3 games, Brian finds Amanda and is able to free her and direct her to the exit. John Wade stares above in the theater rafters, reminiscing about his life. I almost forgot my real name, he says in a whisper to himself. On Halloween night, 1967, a young boy wearing a clown mask wanders from the kitchen after having a late-night snack. He goes to say hi to his mother and baby sister, but the mother is quite a bit unhappy. Why do you always need to wear that stupid mask? She berates him. The child wanders down to a sympathetic father. He tries to console the child and sends him to play some games in his room until bedtime. The child plays Pong on his console game system. As he plays, his mind wanders. He blinks as he sees strange words on the screen. Is it his imagination? Damn it, Billy Carpenter, you're waking Madison with that noise, the mother shouts from the top of the staircase. The mother continues to berate Billy as he walks closer to her. As she shouts, her voice, drawn out as Billy, with no thoughts in his mind, shoves her down the stairs. Billy descends the stairs to find his mother in a mess of brokenness. The father screams, "Billy, what have you done?" Billy is forced to leave his home due to the safety of his baby sister, Madison, and is forced into years of psychiatric care. Yes, that's right, Madison is his sister. Now, I have some thoughts about this revelation, so be sure to stick around at the end of the video so you don't miss out on that. 7 years later, Billy sits on a couch in a social worker's office holding a familiar clown mask. Janine praises Billy on completing his treatment and says he can go to a new adopted family. The Wade family adopts Billy and he takes on a new name, John. Christmas night, 1976. John walks around his house wearing the clown mask like usual. John's adoptive father berates him as he sits, stain covered and drunken in his chair. While Martin is out getting more beer for the drunk father, John slips outside and grabs a power drill from the shed. As he comes back in, mind blank, he walks up behind his dad, "Merry Christmas, Dad," and uses the drill on him. After these events, John manages to frame his brother for the crime and goes on to live a solitary life as a school custodian. William arrives to the amusement park. As he walks into the Mirror Playhouse, John appears and reveals the truth to his father. He claims Madison's death was an accident, that her attack caused him to lose control. He never actually wanted to kill her, just try to visit her. As William storms the park alone, a variety of jumpsuit-donned, clown-wearing people try to attack him. They have glowing collars around their neck. John forces them to follow his orders and participate in the defense, or he will kill them. When William finds John, he removes his mask, revealing the charred skin and damage from the fire at the school, almost entirely unrecognizable. John walks away. William, out of ammo, can do nothing. On another side of the park, Brian, armed with a found crossbow of all things, continues deeper inside. William and John cross paths and decide they are dealing with the Pale Grin tonight, William choosing to keep secret his learnings earlier. As John watches them team up, he realizes he can't succeed in a 2v1 against them, and devises a plan to split them up using a gate switch. Once the pair is separated, John has Amanda's corpse dropped onto William. to weaken his resolve. John is not just a brutal murderer, but apparently also kind of good at psychological warfare. As William takes the other path around, John plays a video on the TV of the nearby roller coaster. It reveals that on September 14th, 1983, the day that Madison died, Brian was passed out drunk at a bar. William, in a rage, declares he is going to kill John and Brian. With William being unable to focus and remain calm, John uses the darkness to slash at him with a knife. With William under a bloodlust, he is unable to focus and find John in the dark. After being slashed repeatedly, in a moment of clarity, William shoots out the lone light inside and manages to hide. Brian wanders into the clown show, only to be ambushed by William. William grabs him by the shirt and punches him square in the face. "It was your fault," he yells. Brian manages to backhand William and free himself. As he grabs his gun, they both aim at each other. "Easy, William," Brian says in a low tone. "I trusted you," William shouts. Brian apologizes and expresses the guilt he holds. In almost slow motion, Brian notices William about to fire and shoots his gun at the same moment. William collapses to his knees. Brian looks down and notices he is fine and uninjured. He hears a cough behind him and sees John Wade, a massive gunshot wound on his torso. William had noticed John behind Brian and fired before it was too late. Before Brian executes him, John Wade reminds Brian that the alcohol and depression will take him eventually, and John Wade is no longer needed. Brian looks at William's body afterwards, and with a tear in his eye mumbles, "I'm sorry, William." Years later, Brian sits at home, surrounded by empty beer bottles and a sleeping Madison at his feet. The Pale Grin's terror is over, but what did it cost? Now, this revelation that Madison was John's sister is interesting. When I first played the first game in 2022, John had a phrase at the end that made him out to be a stalker and in love with Madison. At some point before this game's release, this line changes to make her out to be a friend of his. I'm not a huge fan of editing previously released material to fit a new narrative. This is like publishing a book and then writing a sequel and then telling people you changed the ending of the first book for your second book and they need to go reference that so that you could continue with a different narrative. Technically, you can do whatever you want, but it doesn't feel right. Also, to the point that if someone hasn't played the first game recently, remember, I only did to make a video before I made this one, then they're really confused or have an entirely different mindset going into the game. This was the Happy Hills Homicide 2. Thanks for watching.